All right, it is January 30th and it is 8:30 p.m. and I am doing my 10 minutes in front of the camera. I'm not going to turn off the display completely today because I noticed that in my last video, while it worked, I wasn't paying attention to the camera so much. I also wasn't looking at the camera because there's no face here. And I'm not used to talking to nothing. And so my eyes were all over the place. I wasn't looking at the camera. So um, I'm going to leave the display on because at least I can see my face and it at least feels like I'm talking to somebody. But I'm going to change the display so that all the settings are off. So here we go. So I thought of a topic to talk about today. Why don't we talk about the newly announced Sony A1? So interestingly, I knew that Sony was going to make an announcement before the actual announcement because I was watching Tony Northrup's video. And he was actually talking about how there's a possibility they might announce a curved sensor camera. And I was super stoked about that because that would really be something new. I understand all of what he said, that why a curved sensor camera is better than a traditional flat sensor camera, because you no longer have to worry so much about the distortion towards the periphery, or even things like vignetting towards the periphery, if you have a curved sensor. You know, I mean, we have curved monitors now, right? The idea is that you want a curvature so that everything is about equidistant from you, right? And so similarly, when images get transmitted through the lens, you want it to be kind of equidistant from the center of that lens in order to give sort of the least distorted picture. So yeah, Tony said that there was a possibility that Sony might announce that, and so that's what I was hoping for. That I was hoping that they would announce a radically new curved sensor camera, but of course they didn't. And what they announced was the Sony A1, and a lot of people are really excited about that camera. And for all intents and purposes, it's a very capable camera. It represents sort of the zenith in camera technology today. But unfortunately, it's not a curved sensor camera, right? And so when you're going into an announcement hyped about that, and you get this, yeah, it was a bit of a letdown. Because here's the thing, I think the Sony A1 is basically an incremental upgrade in most aspects, except a couple, and I'll talk about them. What makes the Sony A1 better? Well, it's a 50 megapixel camera, right? So that's a step up for people shooting A9, right? And I mean, I'm not comparing this to the Sony A7R4 because to me, the A1 is more of an action sports camera in the line of the A9s, not so much a high resolution camera like the A7R4. And so 50 megapixels, that's an increase, but that's just it. It's just an incremental increase, right? The fact that it shoots 8K video, well, that's again just kind of an increase from 4K. The fact that it can shoot 30 frames per second, fantastic. I know that sports and wildlife photographers will love this. But again, it's just an increase from 20, So and that's also an incremental upgrade. I mean, all the other stuff is great, flicker free, uh, electronic and mechanical shutters, fantastic. They had that on the A9, at least on the Mark II, so that's great. Decreased rolling shutter, fantastic. But again, that's a incremental upgrade. You just lessening the rolling shutter. Having in-body stabilization is great, but they've always had that in their full-frame bodies. The fact that it can shoot 10-bit, fantastic. Though I think the A7S III did that. So I don't think it shoots raw video, at least not internally. You can output 16-bit raw to an external recorder, but they do have a lossless compressed raw for photography. And that's getting a little bit to what I want to talk about in terms of sort of generational upgrades. But let me just check. Yeah, okay, so there it is. So, all the things that I've mentioned so far are what I would call incremental upgrades. So just something that is slightly improved compared to before, and it's great. It's the newest camera, so it technically should be better, technically. But there aren't that many things that are an actual leap, a generational leap. And one of the things that could be considered a generational leap would be the lossless raw, because I don't know that, or the lossless compressed raw. I don't know that Sony ever shot that a compressed raw before, and if they did, it was probably a lossy compressed raw. So I guess that's great. I think far more significant actually is the fact that it actually shoots in HEF formats, so high efficiency image formats. So not quite raw, but more along the lines of what our phones are doing. I totally agree with Tony Northrup. We need to get away from JPEG. JPEG's been around for way too long. 8 bits was fine, and in many ways it's still fine now, but as camera sensors get bigger, the megapixels get bigger, these JPEG files are getting unnecessarily large. And so, yeah, I think that is the most exciting thing about the A1. Check that out. I actually talked for 10 minutes, but I have more to talk about. So yeah, that's one of the most exciting things for me is that generational leap from JPEG to HEF, right? The raw stuff, it's always existed in some form in higher end cameras, shooting raw. Yeah, it takes a little bit less space now. That's fantastic. But, if you were shooting raw, chances are your workflow was built to deal with the higher or the bigger file sizes. But for the rest of us who are shooting JPEG most of the time, JPEG is so limiting, and it's unnecessarily large. So to see HEF, fantastic. I just want to see Windows PCs get better at dealing with HEF formats, because Apple products they're great at dealing with HEF. They just have some kind of built-in hardware that encodes it or decodes it, and it's so fast. But try working with HEF formats on your Windows PC. It's a nightmare. It's so slow. And I have a pretty high-end gaming laptop here, but it still chugs when it's dealing with files off of my iPhone. So another generational upgrade to me is real-time IF for birds. Birding or bird photography is a major part of wildlife photography. And so to see that finally implemented in one of their flagship cameras is wonderful. To be a generational leap, it doesn't have to necessarily be the first at it. It just has to make that leap, right? It's the same with HEF. Clearly, Sony isn't the first at implementing HEF, but they still needed to make that generational leap. So the last sort of major generational leap that I see is the flash sync. So Sony, I find, has never been great with high speed syncing. Both on my A6400 and my Alpha 65, I think the flash sync speed is something like 1/100th of a second. So Sony has kind of not been great with their flash technology. and to see that they are allowing flash sync speeds up to 1/400th of a second, that is a major leap, right? That's a major generational leap. I know I've been talking about incremental leaps in the past, but like going from 20 frames to 30 frames, it doesn't seem like a whole lot to me. Going from 1/100th of a second to 1/400th of a second, that's a big jump. And so to me, that's less incremental and more generational. You also can't forget the fact that they're now doing flash sync with the electronic shutter, right? So that hasn't been done before, and so now they've done it. To be honest, I'm not really sure why. I'm not sure why you can't do flash sync with an electronic shutter, but I'm not a camera engineer, so I'll just roll with it. So anyway, those are my thoughts about the Sony A1. It's mostly incremental upgrades with a few generational leaps that I think are very welcome. In terms of price, at $6,500, I don't think it's terrible. I know that's kind of shocking coming from me. I love to bash Leica for how much their cameras are. This isn't a brand loyalty thing. I do think that $6,500 is somewhat justifiable if you look at this as a professional sports photography tool, professional wildlife photography tool. The way that the Canon 1DX Mark II, 3, those cameras are like. I know those are DSLRs, but like those were the sort of flagship action cameras, and so this is a flagship action camera. For it to debut at the same price, I think is reasonable. You have to understand that if you have to wonder about this price, it's because this camera is not for you. The people who need this camera have a different relationship with their cameras than you and I might have with our cameras. For the average user, we use our cameras to take pictures of things that we enjoy, things that we want to remember, things that mean something to us. That's what we use our cameras for. Sports photographers and professional photographers as a whole, their relationship with their cameras is not that. Their cameras are tools. They're money-making tools, right? And so they're oftentimes out there shooting something, not because it necessarily means something to them, but because that's what their job requires them to take a picture of. If you're a professional sports photographer, the news outlet that you work for are probably sending you out to shoot pictures of a soccer match, and it doesn't really matter if you care about soccer. It doesn't really matter if you care about the teams that are playing. You're just there to capture key moments for the newspaper, right? And so for them, the camera just has to work flawlessly, and it has to have certain key features that a professional would need. And so there are things on this camera that cause its price to go that high that most of us don't need. For example, the best example is the Ethernet port, right? Most of us don't need an Ethernet port on our cameras, but if you're a professional, you're probably shooting an event as part of a team, and you need images coming off your camera right away. And they need to be time synced with other, members of your team. There are all of these things that a professional photographer would need for their job that we don't need. And so there's a ton of technology in this camera that pros need that we don't need, and thus justify that price. And for all you Leica fanboys, I don't find that I can make the same argument for Leica cameras. I'm sorry, I just can't. Even if a Leica camera came in at under $6,500, I would still struggle to understand why, because It does not implement any professional features that a professional photographer would need. I'm sure they're great cameras. I just don't think that that price is justified. That's all. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I've recorded a very long video today. This is what happens when you get me talking about cameras. I can easily go 20 minutes. So anyway, those are my thoughts about the Sony A1. Man, I want to give my thoughts about the Fuji X-T200 as well, but I think that'll have to be another day. And I'm going to end it here. I'll see you in the next one.